Alright, so massive dub from Blizzard. They actually pulled through with an absolute banger of an update for Diablo 4. We got significant buffs to literally everything. XP gains, rewards, drops, classes, builds, everything you can think of has been buffed in this probably best update we've got so far for Diablo 4. Now, there are going to be some bug fixes here that we're going to drop into in just a little bit, but I want to mostly focus on the big stuff that you're going to immediately notice and will make your life that much better. Starting things off with experience and rewards. So the first two biggest changes are for the XP rates you are awarded for completing Nightmare Dungeons and from defeating monsters in Nightmare Dungeons. Now, I haven't tested these myself, but from the reports I'm hearing, it's pretty much double of what it was before. So if you were to complete a level 50 Nightmare Dungeon, before you would get like 1 million XP, now it's closer to 2 million and so on, which actually sounds significant. Probably even more so in the context that now we are able to teleport directly to Nightmare Dungeons from the map menu, which by the way looks something like this. We get the pop-up and immediately get transported to the Nightmare Dungeon, which I think is actually really awesome and should also cut down the time needed to transport ourselves over there significantly. This doesn't just mean we benefit from twice as fast leveling, but maybe even more than that given the amount of time that we save going to these locations. Similarly, significant buffs were awarded to XP gains for the Whispers and also to the Helltide events, especially the Helltide chest, which I think is another great change right there. Now, also weekly bonus caches from world bosses no longer have a level requirement for the opening, another big dub for this update. Previously, we had a couple of restrictions over there, especially on tier 4. You would need to be level 80 plus, sometimes 82. Pretty annoying. That also got addressed in this update. And since we were talking about Helltides, the roaming bosses will now more consistently drop higher quality loot. If you fought the level 74 one and were disappointed by the drops it had, like how I did and many other players did, then this should be better now in the new update and give you better quality loot. Now, I'm not sure exactly how much that's going to be, but at least it's a buff and we should see it really soon. Now, on top of this, let's also talk about some of the class changes. There are a lot of buffs over here. Not all of them are like huge or anything, just a few percentage changes, but I want you to keep in mind that these are still buffs at the end of the day and your class should feel better than before. So I'm going to take these incremental changes compared to not having them at all, or even worse, having nerfs instead. We're gonna start things off with the Rogue, since it's my favorite class, you know how it is, and probably the biggest buff here is to the Heartseeker. The primary Heartseeker damage increased from 30% to 75%. That's more than double damage compared to before, and absolute banger. Now, is this going to be enough to deter us from using Puncture, which was at the core of many of the meta builds? Not really sure just yet, but maybe just will, since it already has some vulnerable baked into it. It's an awesome skill to have. Plus, it was one of my favorite in the betas, especially with the Barrage build, but I believe a rapid fire one could also make use of it. Not sure just yet, we're gonna test it, but it definitely looks much better than before. Also, Smoke Grenade, interestingly enough, I did like this in one of the previous builds I covered, and it does seem to get a reduction in cooldown from 15 to just 13 seconds. There are a couple of really interesting aspects that drop automatic smoke grenades, like at the end of a dash and whatnot. So this could work really well with that. Not really sure just yet, but there are some interesting mechanics with the days that you can play off in here to spread that to enemies, and even like spread vulnerable a lot easier to spam these. So maybe this can help quite a bit with that. Now, on top of that, we also have the Rain of Arrow. There's a cooldown reduction here and also a damage to the imbuement. So cooldown reduction from 60 to 55 seconds, and prime Rain of Arrows imbuement potency increase from 20 to 30%. Also, Volley, the dismount attack, is also getting a nice buff from 70 to 105%. Not sure it's gonna matter too much, but hey, it's over there. Invigorating Strike, base damage by 2%, Blade Shift by 1%, and there's also for the Forceful Arrow, another like 2% increased over there for the base damage. Barrage is also seeing a buff, again not so big, but hey, it's a nice 2% to have on top. What I'm most excited for, however, are the passives, especially for the Umbrous aspect. The lucky hit chance to gain a Dark Shroud has increased from 30 to 50%, all the way to 40 to 60%, so that's like a 10% buff over there. Not really bad, but this works really well with the penetrating shot build that we covered before to generate even more, and should help a ton with some of the other builds. You're gonna pretty much need the defensives for some of the higher end nightmare dungeons. This right here helps a ton with that, as we covered before. Otherwise, close quarters combat, another significant increase in damage from 20 to 30%. This is pretty much a staple for a lot of the melee builds, especially like the twisting blades. You're gonna use this, so nice over there. Escape artist cooldown reduction from 100 to 45 seconds. Now that is actually a good one, and this also automatically drops some of those smoke grenades every like 45 seconds when you get hit and whatnot. So it might play very well with a smoke grenade kind of build that we might even check out in future videos. Now, Barbarian is another class that sees a lot of buffs in terms of survivability, but also base damage to many of its skills and also legendary aspects. Iron Skin pretty much gets a double buff compared to before, so enhanced Iron Skin barrier increased from 10% to 20% of the maximum life, essentially being twice as good as it was before. Another one, the kick, it gets a pretty good cooldown reduction from 17 to 13 seconds, and also the base damage dealt to enemies knocked back into terrain increased from 54 to 70%. Now, Call of the Ancients also gets twice as much in terms of attack speed from 10% to 20%, should make the skill even better than before. I also want to talk about some of these like base damage increases you're seeing all over the place. Bounding Slam from 75 to 112. Mighty Leap, the slow on this one actually increases to 70%. Now, Charge is also getting the base damage dealt increase to knock back enemies from 15 to 30%. Another double buff, essentially. Double Swing from 36 to just 40%. Flay, really great on the bleeds right there from 36 to 40%. Also, more Fury generated, and enhanced Flay vulnerable chance has increased from 10% to 15%. And you're seeing this pretty much all across all of these skills, but also into some of the legendary aspects. So for example, Dust Devils, flat damage increase from 0.16 to like 0.22 all the way to 0.32. Also, aspect of the Iron Warrior has a damage reduction increase from 10 to 20% to 15 to 25%. Again, as I've said, some pretty good defensive buffs over here as well. Also, the Overkill damage increase from 16 30% to 24 38, and Hellhammer flat damage increase from 35 to 6-8. Moving on to Druids, maybe even bigger buffs than before, mostly to the most unused skills, but a couple of really meta builds like the Stormwolf get some massive buffs over there, especially with the Lightning Storm builds. This is something that you're going to really like a lot. So starting with the Lightning Storm, enhanced Lightning Storm duration increase from 4 to 6 seconds, and Primal Lightning Storm chance to immobilize increase from 8 to 12%. Wolves, which are still kinda bad, at least have a reduced cooldown from 14 to 11 seconds, and they also have a much better Ferocious Wolfpack Lucky Hit chance increase from 10 to 40%. This basically means they are much better at generating Fortify, and if they are much better at generating Fortify, it means clearing nightmare dungeons on very high levels is going to be even better than before. Plus, you have extra CC from that Lightning Storm buff, and plenty more in here to help you with that. Also, Hurricane base damage increased to 134%, previously just 97.5. Like Cataclysm 52 to 64, Lacerate 400 to 460. There are plenty more over here that are actually really amazing. Pretty much everything for the Druid is now amazing. Earth Spike base damage increased from 16 to 70%, more spirit generation, and also the Fierce Earth Spike Fortify increased from 4% to 8%. Again, this was already a pretty tanky class, now it's going to be even better with this build. In terms of the passives, pretty much all capstones, maybe except a couple of them, including the meta one, are getting buffs. So Bestial Rampage attack speed bonus from 20 to 25%, and damage bonus from 20 to 30% when switching between Werewolf or Werebear. Is this going to be enough to make you switch from Earth and Might? I'm not really sure, probably not, but it's nice to maybe promote a bit more build diversity. Also, Nature's Fury, chance to cast a free spell increased from 20 to 30%. Looks pretty interesting. And Lupin Ferocity damage bonus increased from 60 to 70%. Probably the least significant in this case. Not really sure just yet, but on the critical strikes, it does seem that it helps us a bit with that. In terms of the legendary aspects, not sure if any of the buffs to these right here are going to make them more appealing to you, since it's not like you're going to make much use of something like Seismic Shift, for example, or something like the Mangled, even though you do benefit from the resource generation on it. I think that there are just much better resources out there that you can use anyway, and those weren't changed, they are still the best. So yeah, just leaving it at that. Now for Necromancer, nothing too wild, but pretty much everything gets a buff, including like bone skills and blood skills likewise, and also CC and generating resources. Reap gets a reduction in cooldown, Decompose base damage increased by about 3%. Also, the base essence generation has increased by 1 point, and it now forms corpses more frequently every 2 seconds instead of just 2.5. Hemorrhage base damage increased from 25 to 27, like I said, not too significant, and a bit more extra essence generation. Maybe the most significant buffs are to Bloodlance and Iron Maiden. So in the case of the Bloodlance, the overpower proc now happens every 6th cast instead of every 8th one. So pretty nice, like 30 and something% change over there. Also the Iron Maiden base damage increased from 10 to 20%, and also the Horrid Iron Maiden damage bonus increased from 15 to 20%. Minion builds will likely be a lot more happy with some of the changes here to the AI. For example, Ray Skeletons and Golem will now always engage targets with a cast curse instead of actually waiting over there and pretty much not doing anything. Additionally, for all Druid and Necromancer companions and minions, maximum damage over time taken per damage instance reduced from 2% to 1% of the maximum life. So that should further help them stay up for longer, maybe even make some of the minion builds a lot more viable. Now, as far as legendary aspects, Fast Blood ultimate cooldown reduction increased. In this case, is it going to be enough? I'm not really sure. It's not like we're using ultimates too much, maybe unless you're going with an Army of the Dead build and want like Blood Essence to give you a lot of cooldown and help you with that, reduce the cooldown on the ultimates. Maybe that will help you a bit. Flesh Rending, on the other hand, could be useful, especially now that we got that pretty interesting buff after Decompose. In this case, can spawn a corpse and you gain a lot more essence than before, from 1020 to 2040, pretty much doubling that effect. So it's much better. And also Bursting Bone, the flat damage has also almost doubled. Are you going to use this? Maybe if you use Bone Prison and you want it to deal damage when it expires, but there are better options in there. However, it might prove to be useful and maybe change some of the stuff up if you're going with that build. And finally, for the Sorcerer, I'm not gonna lie, as somebody who does play a Sorcerer in the endgame, I do kind of wish that they were a bit more significant in terms of buffs, but they are still all across the board very helpful. So Spark is also getting buffed, base damage increased by about 2%, enhanced Spark damage increased by another like 1.4%, and Flickering Spark chance increased from 3 to 4%. Again, these changes are not that big, just a few percentages. Frostbolt base damage from 35% to 38%. So both the Arc Lash and the Ice Shard Sorcerers are getting buffed in this. Charged Bolts base damage from 28 to 30%. Firebolt burning damage from 40 to 44. Even though Firebolt, we mostly use this to have burning effect and kind of use it in our enhancement slot. Incinerate base damage increased from 49 to 54. This is one of the more significant ones. Not really sure if you're going to run with Incinerate after this small, very insignificant buff. Also enhanced Incinerate damage from 15% to 25%, and greater Incinerate immobilize requirement reduced from 4 to 3 seconds. Again, not gonna use it, not gonna lie. Fireball mana cost decreased from 40 to 35. Again, this is one of those skills that I mostly run with my builds on the enchantment slot, and I use them for the AoE when leveling up and whatnot. So it's not going to change much for me, the fact that the mana cost has been reduced. Now, for the Frozen Orb, initial base damage also has been increased by like 4%. The explosion damage increased from 29 to 34, and the greater Frozen Orb chance to apply vulnerable increased from 25 to 30%. I'm pretty sure that I haven't run a frozen orb kind of build since the beta, and I'm not sure you do want to do it since ice shard doesn't even need it, but if you want to use it and if you have any place left on the skill bar, which let's be honest you're not, because you're gonna use all the shields and like the teleport, you're still not gonna use this. Maybe in another couple more patches that update this. Blizzard base damage increased by 10%, really insignificant. It's not going to really change anything. Ice Blades, however, chance to apply vulnerable increased to 40% is a welcomed change. Though I will say I actually dropped this immediately after testing it once, I believe, in the beta. Why would I want to spread more vulnerable with something like Ice Blades when I can just do a Frost Nova, which instantly applies vulnerable? I'm just gonna use that instead. It's a much better source of doing it. Lightning Spear, the Summon Lightning Spear maximum damage bonus increased from 100 to 160%. This is again one of the more significant buffs, which can help a little bit if you are trying things out, new things, and going with a lightning build. But maybe it's not going to be like the best option in terms of what damage you can deal with a lightning build. Arc Lash is still going to be probably the meta for this class, and you're going to continue using it regardless. Now, legendary aspects also got a pretty interesting change in here too. For example, Incendiary, the chance to restore mana increased from 5-10% to 12-17%. So this was pretty good on the Firewall build, I believe, though I kind of dropped that off before level 50. It's still nonetheless a really good build, and it does help a lot with mana regeneration in this case. Also, speaking of mana regen, Concentration, mana regen increased from 10-20% to 20-30%. Concentration, mana regeneration increased from 10-20% to 20-30%, though you have to not get hit for about 3 seconds for this to proc, and there are better sources to regenerate your mana. Also, in the case of the Abundant Energy, the chance to chain an additional enemy increased from 20 and 30% to 30-40. This is for Crackling Energy, so it theoretically could make it a bit more appealing if you're going with a build like that. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm pretty sure this isn't going to change the meta one bit, maybe with a couple of exceptions here and there, but for the most part it should be the same, though I will do some tests in the next couple of days and come back if there's any like significant changes to some of my favorite classes. This is it. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time.